For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. I ran across a talk by Graham Hancock, and in his presentation he made some interesting claims relating to flood stories from around the world, and how they line up with a series of events that took place at the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago. If these stories do indeed go back to that time, that would be a big discovery, and an amazing coincidence. I checked into his assertions to see if they are based in fact, and what I found may surprise you. Welcome to the Myths of Ancient History series, which looks at popular misinformation on YouTube and the internet. This time around, we're going to be looking at some statements made by Graham Hancock. Hancock, as you may know, is an author of many books in the alternative ancient history niche. In fact, he's probably the most successful of all those making a living from this subject. Over the years, he has written so many fascinating and controversial claims about ancient history that I most certainly cannot address them all in one video. In this one, I'm going to focus on a specific set of claims he has made about a great deluge, which he believes occurred some 12,000 years ago, and which he connects to the world's flood myths. Let's take a look at part of a public presentation he gave, which can be found in the video Graham Hancock, Atlantis, and the Great World Flood, which appears on the Ancient TV channel.
So there's our familiar map of the world with its familiar contours. But if you go back to the last glacial maximum 21,000 odd years ago, the world really does look quite different.
Just to bring you up to speed, the last glacial maximum is the most recent period of time that the Earth's ice sheets were at their maximum extent. It ran from about 31,000 to 16,000 years ago. It was about 6 degrees Celsius colder, or 11 degrees Fahrenheit colder, on average back then. When the temp is colder and there's more ice, the sea level is lower.
For example, there was no Red Sea. It was all dry land. Nor was there any Arabian Gulf. It was all dry land as well. Australia was a much vaster continent than it is today. And Southeast Asia, now an archipelago of islands and the Malaysian peninsula, was at that time a giant continent-sized landmass. All of the coastlines of the world were extended much further than they are today.
I'm not so sure there was no Red Sea at all, but yes, there definitely was more land back then. Now, why is Hancock making this point? The now submerged land is, for him, the location of possible lost cities.
And altogether, 27 million square kilometers, that's about 10 million square miles of land, went under the ocean when the sea levels rose. That's roughly the equivalent of the size of Europe and China added together.
Okay, so here he's emphasizing how much submerged land there is. How he got the figure of 27 million square kilometers, I don't know, but he seems to be talking about the amount of land that was exposed at the peak of the last glacial maximum compared to today. But why would he be doing that? If we wanted to calculate the area of land that lost cities destroyed in a flood 12,000 years ago could have been sitting on, we would compare the sea level at the time just before this flood with the sea level at the time just after. And I can guarantee you that it would have been far less area than the figure he's giving you, because the sea level has continued to rise until today. So I would classify his statement about 27 million square kilometers as misleading.
Now, although the meltdown did take place over 10,000 years, there were within it 3 or 4 major episodes of flooding when you could, in some cases, get as much as a 30-foot rise in sea level pretty much overnight.
These major episodes he's talking about are called meltwater pulses. They refer to periods of time when ice was melting at a more rapid rate than normal, Meltwater Pulse 1A, Meltwater Pulse 1B, and Meltwater Pulse 1C. Meltwater Pulse 1C occurred about 8,000 years ago, long after the time that Hancock presumes a great deluge to have occurred, so it can be set aside as not applicable. I investigated, and it turns out that in neither of the other pulses was there a 30-foot rise in sea level overnight. Let's take a closer look. Meltwater Pulse 1A occurred around 14,600 years ago, when the sea level rose between 16 and 25 meters. But this was over several centuries. The rate of sea level rise was 40 to 60 millimeters per year. Meltwater Pulse 1B occurred beginning around 11,500 years ago, during which the sea rose 28 meters over 500 years, approximately 40 millimeters per year, though more recent studies suggest it was about half that. It is clear that Hancock's claim of 30 feet overnight is unsupported by evidence.
Now you have to consider what a 30-foot overnight rise in sea level would do to our civilization today if it were to happen. I'm sure we've all seen the horrific and troubling images of the tsunami in Japan, and we can see the catastrophe that is unleashed by nature just by a temporary rise in sea level. So we have to imagine something like that, but on a global scale and permanent, and consider what it did to our ancestors and what effects it may have had upon them.
Note how he is assuming not only that there was a 30-foot rise in sea level overnight, but that it was like a tsunami. Don't get me wrong, there was a rise in sea level, and I'm sure that when ice melted and fell into the sea, it may have caused tsunamis from time to time. Tsunamis may have been caused by other means too. But while a slow sea level rise would have been global, tsunamis are not a global phenomenon, and they are not permanent. After a tsunami, the sea level returns to where it was. So his comments here are misleading.
I don't believe it's an accident that there are more than 2,000 flood myths pretty much all around the world. Memories of a gigantic global flood that almost wiped out mankind.
When he speaks of 2,000 flood myths, he can only be referring to every single version out there, which includes versions of the same flood myth, such as every time an ancient writer repeats the Greek story of the flood of Deucalion, or repeats the Mesopotamian flood story. There are not 2,000 different flood myths. I think that's worth clarifying. And flood myths are not from every part of the world. Japan has none, Central Asia has none, Northern Europe had none before the Greeks and Romans got there. Flood stories are extremely rare in Africa. This is kind of strange if you believe that those places experienced a great flood 12,000 years ago. And the number that speak of a worldwide flood are limited. So his statement that more than 2,000 flood myths remember a gigantic global flood is misleading.
Most archaeologists and historians are not very impressed with flood myths, and they take the view that these were little local events, perhaps a river flooded its banks, little local events which were then elaborated out by our superstitious ancestors who imagined it was a global flood. But I find that a completely unnecessary explanation, since we know that there was gigantic global flooding during the 10,000 years at the end of the Ice Age. And it seems to me highly probable that the world's legacy of flood myths are a memory of what happened at the end of the Ice Age.
Considering that major floods happen all the time, we see them in the news, we have records of them happening all over the world going back for as long as our records last, what do you think are the chances that every ancient flood story, or even that a majority of them, no matter where we are in the world, refers to the same flood? Many of these flood stories do not refer to a global flood. They're just big floods, and they differ considerably in detail. I would say the chances are low, wouldn't you? I mean, think about it. Early humans almost invariably settled near water, whether that be the sea, lakes, or rivers. People who live near water are bound to experience floods, and probably fairly often. This happens even in modern times. In 1931, several rivers in China overflowed and drowned more than 1 million people, and caused millions more to suffer from famine and disease. That's something the people there are not going to forget. It will be preserved in oral and written traditions. And we all know, we've experienced probably many times in our lives, that people do like to embellish stories. It's human to do so. Every time Uncle Joe tells you about the fish he caught, it seems to get bigger. Each time Grandpa tells you about the blizzard of '77, the snow mounds seem to get higher. Mr. Hancock says that embellishment is an unnecessary explanation, implying that it goes too far. He proposes instead that all these flood stories are likely a memory of a single flood at the end of the Ice Age. It's almost as if he thinks his explanation is less far-fetched, but an extreme coincidence of that sort is not more believable than saying humans are just acting human.
One of those flood myths was preserved by Plato, and that's the myth of Atlantis.
For context and to refresh our memories, let's take a look at the account of the destruction of Atlantis. Okay, so here Plato's character, Critias, is telling the story, and after describing a battle in which the Athenians defeat the Atlanteans, he says, quote, "But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men," that's the Athenian army, "in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis, in like manner, disappeared in the depths of the sea. For which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island." So, the first thing to note here is that earthquakes and floods are mentioned. So yes, I guess you can call this a flood legend, in a loose sense. The Athenian army sinks into the earth, presumably in an earthquake, and the island of Atlantis sinks into the sea. The island is said to subside. What that means is that it was the island that moved, not the sea. This is not a rising of the sea level, but a sinking of Atlantis. It doesn't fit very well with Hancock's perception of a flood caused by tsunamis or rising waters.
He said he got it through his family line from the Greek lawmaker Solon, who had visited Egypt and had been told in Egypt of the existence of a high civilization in deep antiquity that had been destroyed in a global flood, accompanied by tremendous earthquakes and volcanic activities.
Mr. Hancock seems to be confused. It is Critias, the speaker in the book, who says he was given the tale from his ancestor Solon, not Plato. Plato never speaks personally in his books. It's not until hundreds of years later that people started saying Plato was related to Solon and that he received the story from him personally. One of those embellishments we were talking about earlier. And the story of Atlantis is never said to be global in Plato's writings. And it cannot possibly be a global flood because Critias speaks of the city of Athens and the Egyptians as existing both before and after the destruction. It's just Atlantis that gets destroyed without a trace. So, both of these statements by Hancock are factually incorrect. But here's the interesting thing. Plato refers to other flood legends. In ancient Greece, there were several, and Critias alludes to this in Plato's book, The Critias, when he says, quote, "Many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years, for that is the number of years which have elapsed since the time of which I am speaking," unquote. He means the time of the war between Athens and Atlantis, which is not historical, by the way. These deluges would include the flood of Deucalion, sometimes called the Great Deluge, and the flood of Dardanus. And he says there were great floods prior to the destruction of Atlantis, too. He speaks of a flood that exposed the rock of the Acropolis in Athens, which he calls the third flood before that of Deucalion. Yes, the Greeks had many deluges in their legends. In Greek legend, it is the flood of Deucalion which is said to have been worldwide. It was the big one. So a question arises. In Plato's writings, is the flood of Deucalion the same flood that destroyed Atlantis. Let's take a look at how Critias introduces the Atlantis story. He quotes the Egyptians as saying to Solon, "In the first place, you remember a single deluge only," referring to Deucalion's flood. "But there were many previous ones. In the next place, you do not know that there formerly dwelt in your land the fairest and noblest race of men which ever lived, and that you and your whole city are descended from a small seed or remnant of them which survived Deucalion's flood. And this was unknown to you, because for many generations the survivors of that destruction died, leaving no written word. For there was a time, Solon, before the great deluge of all, when the city which now is Athens was first in war, and in every way the best governed of all cities, is said to have performed the noblest deeds, and to have had the fairest constitution of any of which tradition tells under the face of heaven." Unquote. So he is saying here that prior to the great deluge, Athens was inhabited by a noble race of men, and they fought with Atlantis. But the fact that he tells Solon that there were many deluges before the great one, and then relates the Atlantis tale, suggests that the flood that destroyed Atlantis is one that happened before the great one. In other words, he's giving Solon a story of an earlier deluge. This earlier deluge was not worldwide, as is evidenced by the survival not only of Athens, even if battered, but also the Egyptians themselves. It is not the flood of Deucalion.
And this civilization, Plato said, was globally distributed, although focused on an island which he appeared to locate in the Atlantic.
So I went and double-checked this, suspecting this to be inaccurate. And it turns out that nowhere in Plato does it say that the civilization of Atlantis was globally distributed. Instead, Critias says that it had rule over the whole island and several others, and over parts of the continent of Atlantis. And furthermore, the men of Atlantis had subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Heracles as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, western Italy. That's not anywhere near global, so we have to classify this claim as factually incorrect.
And he said that in a single terrible day and night, it was utterly obliterated. And that mankind was forced to begin again like children with no memory of what went before, that we were indeed a species with amnesia.
He seems to be referring to a conversation that Plato composed for his book The Laws between Clinias and an unnamed Athenian. But in this dialogue, the deluge they refer to is the Great Deluge, and therefore the flood of Deucalion. Hancock again incorrectly connects it with Atlantis.
The flood myth is found in India, where we have the Indian Noah figure, Manu, who is preserved by the god Vishnu to repopulate the planet, much in the way that Noah does in our Western flood story.
There are similarities between the Indian flood legend and the ones found in the Near East, including the biblical account. The earliest Indian version appears in a late Vedic text called the Shatapatha Brahmana, which dates to the 7th or 6th century BCE. It's also found in the Mahabharata and the Matsya Purana. The similarities with the Near Eastern versions include the building of a ship by the protagonist, the bringing on board of animals and or seeds of life, the landing on a high mountain, and the performing of a sacrifice at the end. Also that the flood was worldwide. Modern scholars generally agree that there is some borrowing going on, either from Mesopotamia to India or vice versa. But we should note that there is no similarity between the Indian flood legend and the legend of Atlantis.
And in Greece, it's the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who ride out the flood in a huge box. And again, their role is to repopulate the earth and to reestablish civilization.
What is interesting about the flood legend of Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha is that in the earliest extant versions, such as we find in Plato, it is said that Deucalion and Pyrrha survived a destructive deluge, but there's no mention of it being a worldwide flood or of them building a boat or a chest to survive it, bringing animals on board and landing on a mountain, until Roman times. Those features were put into the story later, after the Bible had been translated into Greek and the story of Noah was well known to the Greeks. So that raises the possibility that the Greco-Roman legend was influenced by the biblical account in later times. In other words, the Deucalion legend, in its later forms, cannot be said to be a wholly independent tradition.
Similar stories have come down from the ancient Maya, who spoke of cyclical destructions and rebirths of the earth, and indeed the Aztec civilization as well.
We have a similar phenomenon going on with the Maya flood myths as we have with Greece. All of our extant accounts of Maya flood myths come from a time after Christian missionaries began their work in Mesoamerica, teaching the Maya the Bible. In fact, a number of the Maya flood stories have clear biblical references in them. It is probably true that there were earlier versions of Maya flood myths that preceded the ones we currently know about, but their similarity to the biblical account then would have been minimal, the main story simply being that the gods destroyed people in a flood during the time of creation. That's about it. This image, which Hancock displays in his presentation, is supposed to be of an ancient Maya stone frieze. It's not a photo, but a drawing in a modern Maya revival art style, not seen on ancient Maya monuments. It first appeared in a book on Atlantis by Robert Stacy Judd, who was himself an illustrator. Not only has the frieze never been seen by anyone, but this picture of it is the only one in existence. It's safe to conclude it came from Stacy Judd's imagination.
And of course, we all know the Noah story from the Bible. Now, it's well accepted by scholars that the Noah story is simply a later recension of an earlier story that came from Sumer, from Mesopotamia, the land that we now call Iraq. And that story is the epic of Gilgamesh.
Scholars are of the opinion not that the biblical version drew directly from the Epic of Gilgamesh, but that both go back to an earlier source. All of the stories about a great deluge in the Near East share common features. In Mesopotamia, we have the Sumerian versions featuring Ziud-Sera, recorded in the 18th and 17th centuries BCE, and the Assyrian and Babylonian version preserved in the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, featuring Utnapishtim. We also have an alternate Assyro-Babylonian version starring Atrahasis. Then there's a version told by Berosus, a 3rd century BCE Babylonian priest, which is based on some of these earlier traditions. The similarities show that there is a relation between them. But while 3 specific regions of the world, namely the Near East, South Asia, and classical Greece, which neighbored each other, have flood stories that share a unique set of features, it would be incorrect to say, as it is often said, that all flood stories of the world are similar, or have much in common. Sometimes in these stories, the deluge is described simply as a first stage in the creation of the world. Sometimes a god sends a flood in order to destroy the first race of humans, or to punish some animal for its misbehavior. Or the flood may be sent without any reason at all. And humans try to save their lives in different ways, climbing up mountains or trees, floating on the water in a hollow pumpkin or in a wooden box. There are plenty of versions and combinations of various motifs and themes, many of these natural products of the human psyche. And it seems quite clear that the reason why the Near East, India, and Greece share similar flood stories is because of influence between them, that is, oral or literary influence. Stories were passed between the peoples in the area. They cannot be said to be independent witnesses to a specific event, which is what Mr. Hancock is suggesting they are.
And therefore it's interesting, I think, to look at what happened in the Arabian Gulf, the region from which the Epic of Gilgamesh comes, to look at what happened in the Arabian Gulf at the end of the Ice Age. This, of course, is the Gulf today, and this is how it looked during the last Ice Age. That is not an inlet of the sea there. That is a large river system combining the streams of the Tigris and the Euphrates, which had a series of very fertile lakes running along its length, all of which was flooded in one gigantic incident approximately 12,000 years ago. So I'm not at all surprised that a powerful memory of a cataclysmic flood is preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
I can't help but note how Hancock looks here at a map of the sea level 12,000 years ago and assumes it was caused by a cataclysm, when all we are looking at is the sea level, which rose to this position gradually over time. There is no evidence for a gigantic incident in the Arabian Gulf at that time, at least none that I've been able to find. If you can find evidence for a cataclysm in the Arabian Gulf at that time, please let me know. Until then, I have to identify his statement as unsupported by evidence.
Same is true with the Aborigines of Australia. We can see Australia today and Australia as it looked during the last ice age. Clearly, a huge amount of land has been swallowed up by the sea, and Aborigine myths remember this time and speak of a great flood serpent that ate up the land.
The Australian flood myths bear little resemblance to any of the other flood myths of the world, and no resemblance at all to the Atlantis legend. So I can see no justification for assuming it refers to the same event as any of the others. We have to ask ourselves, how can we determine whether it is more likely that the world's flood legends all go back to a single event, or that they are based on different floods that have occurred through history? If there are significant and unique features of the stories that tie them together, then we could say that they go back to a common source, whether that be an event or a literary or oral source. How many significant and unique features do the flood legends around the world have? Destruction by water is not a unique enough feature, because for any major flood event, you'd have that, no matter where you are in the world or when it was. This will feature in 100% of cases. The sparing of human life also is not unique enough, because if everybody died, there would be no one left to tell the tale. Every flood story by necessity must have survivors. How about divine causation? Since in ancient times every natural disaster of any kind was attributed to the work of the gods, this is not a unique or special feature of the story either. Without those features, destruction by water, the existence of survivors, and divine causation, we can no longer say that the flood stories around the world are linked, because I have found that there are no other features that tie them all together. There are a number of them that describe a flood as worldwide, but this is rarer than you think. And when it is part of the story of the creation of the world, as in the Maya tradition, it's to be expected. There are some that depict survivors having used a waterborne vessel, but this also is more uncommon than you think. Plus, it is also hardly surprising. How many different ways are there to survive a flood? In a few tales, survivors climb up to higher ground, or they take refuge in treetops. And as you might expect, in a few, they use something that floats. The flood stories that do share some unique features that tie them together come from areas in contact with one another. The stories were being shared.
As I say, I'm not surprised that we have these myths. I do believe we are a species with amnesia, and the myths are part of our memory, of a huge part of our story that we've lost.
The idea that a legend could have some basis in historical fact in itself has some merit. But what Hancock proposes, namely that the flood legends around the world, with all their notable differences, refer to the same event, seems extremely far-fetched to me. And his proposal that they refer to an event 12,000 years ago, which does not fit any of the world's flood legends, also seems highly improbable. The only real link he has with any legend is the one about Atlantis, because even though the disaster it describes does not fit what happened 12,000 years ago, Critias dates it to around that time, give or take a century. The problem is that other flood stories give different dates. The flood of Deucalion, the worldwide deluge of Greek tradition, was dated to around 1528 BCE by the Parian Chronicle, the first known text to give it an exact date. The biblical flood is dated to the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. The Sumerian king list gives a date well over 30,000 years ago. The Indian Manu flood is dated even older than that. But Hancock wants to use Plato's dating, which isn't even in regard to the worldwide deluge. Nothing fits. So, sadly, research has shown that this portion of Hancock's presentation is not only naively hopeful, but is full of inaccuracies, sketchy reasoning, unsupported claims, and misleading comments. And because he's so popular, and people have repeated his statements many times, I felt it was a good candidate for analysis here in the Myths of Ancient History series. If you liked this video or learned anything from it, please give it a like. Thank you for watching. You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word, so feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.